In 1315, Duke Leopold of Habsburg led a military force into central Switzerland to assert control over the forest cantons of Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden. The army moved along the road near Lake Ageri toward the Morgarten Pass. The route was narrow, with steep ground on one side and marshland on the other, limiting formation and cavalry movement. Swiss forces, composed mainly of local militia, occupied higher ground overlooking the road. They allowed the column to enter the confined section before attacking. The Habsburg troops were unable to deploy or retreat effectively. Fighting occurred at close range, where heavy armor and horses offered little advantage. The engagement ended with a decisive Habsburg defeat and secured Swiss independence for the region. In the early 14th century, the heart of Europe was a complex web of power dominated by the Holy Roman Empire. And within that empire, few families were as ambitious as the Habsburgs. They had their eyes on the vital trade routes crisscrossing the continent, especially the Gotthard Pass, the shortest route to the riches of Italy. But standing in their way was a stubborn pocket of resistance deep in the Alps, the forest cantons of Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden. These weren't city dwellers or courtiers. They were mountain folk, farmers, hunters, and herdsmen who valued their freedom from the heavy hand of feudal lords. In 1291, they'd formalized their cooperation in a defense pact known as the Eternal Alliance, the foundational document of what would one day become Switzerland. They didn't want to overthrow the empire. They just wanted to be left alone, governed by their own councils. The Habsburgs, however, saw this independence as rebellion. Their desire to control the lucrative Alpine passes put them on a collision course with the cantons. Tensions simmered for years. The final spark came in early 1314. In a dispute over grazing rights, men from Schwyz, led by their magistrate Werner Stauffacher, raided the nearby abbey of Einsiedeln. The abbey was under Habsburg protection, and the raid was an open act of defiance. The men of Schwyz plundered the monastery, drank the monks' wine, and took several of them hostage. For the Habsburgs, this was an insult that couldn't be ignored. Duke Leopold I of Austria, brother of the Habsburg claimant to the imperial throne, saw his chance. Leopold was the embodiment of chivalric arrogance. He saw the Swiss as unruly peasants, an inconvenience to be swept aside. He wouldn't just punish Schwyz, he'd make an example of them. The chronicler John of Winterthur wrote that Leopold's army came together to utterly subdue and humiliate those peasants. He was so confident that he reportedly brought along a large supply of ropes, ready to hang the rebel leaders. As his own court jester is said to have warned him, "You have all taken counsel how best to get into the country, but have given no explanation of how you are going to get out again." The stage was set. On one side, a prince of the empire leading the epitome of medieval military might. On the other, the common men of the forest cantons, fighting not for glory, but for their homes, their families, and their freedom. It was a clash of two worlds, and it would unfold in a narrow pass that was about to become infamous. As autumn turned to winter in 1315, Duke Leopold I assembled his army. While medieval chroniclers gave wildly exaggerated figures, modern historians estimate a formidable force of between 2,000 and 9,000 men. But its true strength wasn't just numbers, it was quality. At its core were up to 2,000 heavily armored knights, the pride of Austrian and Swabian nobility. These guys were the medieval equivalent of main battle tanks, encased in plate and mail, mounted on powerful war horses, and trained from birth for the charge. They were the dominant force on any open battlefield. Each knight was a walking fortress. They were backed by a large body of professional men-at-arms and disciplined infantry. They weren't marching to a battle, they were marching to an execution. Leopold's plan was simple: a lightning strike. He would march his main force south from the city of Zug, along the eastern shore of Lake Egerie. This route would take him through the Morgarten Pass, a back door, into Schwyz. He planned to catch the defenders completely off guard. The thought that a peasant militia would dare to contest his passage seems to have never entered his mind. He was a master of flat, open fields. The rugged, claustrophobic world of the High Alps was alien to him. Meanwhile, in the valleys, the news of Leopold's army was met not with panic, but with grim resolve. The call to arms went out. The men who answered were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, woodsmen, and craftsmen led by Werner Stauffacher, the same man who had led the raid on the abbey. He wasn't a nobleman trained in war, but a local who knew his people and, crucially, his land. His force numbered around 1,500 men from Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden. Outnumbered and out-equipped, they knew a conventional battle was suicide. They couldn't match the knights in armor or training, but they had other advantages. They were fighting on their home ground. They were fighting for survival, and they weren't bound by the chivalric code. They were pragmatic, and they were desperate. This desperation fueled their ingenuity. They looked at their homeland not as a backdrop, but as their primary weapon. They wouldn't meet Leopold's army in the open. They would lure the lion into a cage of their own making, and they had the perfect spot in mind. The Swiss strategy was a masterpiece of tactical genius. They wouldn't try to defeat the Habsburg army. They would lead it to destroy itself. The chosen location was the Morgarten Pass, a place seemingly designed by nature for an ambush. On November 15th, 1315, the path Leopold's army had to take was a narrow track, wedged in a terrifying bottleneck. On one side, the cold, deep waters of Lake Egerie. On the other, a steep wooded slope rising to a ridge. This terrain was the perfect kill box. It was a natural funnel, about 2 kilometers long, that would force Leopold's army into a stretched-out column. The knights, so formidable on an open plain, would be rendered impotent. There was no room to form a line, no space to charge. Their greatest strength, mobility, would be completely neutralized. But a trap is useless unless it's sprung at the right moment. The Swiss plan was precise. Legend says a friendly knight fired an arrow into the Swiss camp with a message tied to it, warning them to beware at Morgarten. This gave them time to prepare. First, they built a roadblock at a key choke point. It wasn't meant to be an impenetrable fortress, just a trigger. When the front of the column was forced to stop, the rest of the massive army would continue pressing forward, creating a human traffic jam. Second, they prepared their secret weapon, gravity. High up on the wooded slopes, hidden from view, they loosened massive boulders and felled countless trees, preparing a man-made avalanche. This wasn't just random debris. These were aimed projectiles. The goal was to create maximum chaos, shatter the invaders' nerve, and, most importantly, panic their horses. A knight without his mount is just a man in a heavy metal suit. A knight on a terrified horse is a danger to himself and everyone around him. Finally, concealed further down the slope were the Swiss assault teams, and they carried a weapon that would become a symbol of Swiss military power: the halberd. The halberd was a revolutionary piece of military tech. It was a simple but brutal polearm, about 2 meters long, combining a spear point for thrusting, a heavy axe blade for crushing blows, and a sharp hook on the back. Its genius was its versatility. It was an all-purpose tool of death that allowed a simple foot soldier to defeat a mounted knight. Against the steel-clad chivalry of Austria, the halberd was the great equalizer. The axe blade could hamstring a horse, bringing its rider crashing down. The hook could snag a knight's armor and pull him off his feet. Once he was on the ground, struggling in the mud. The spear point could find the weak spots in his armor, the armpits, the groin, the visor slits. It was cheap to make and required strength more than years of refined training, the perfect weapon for a militia. The trap was set. The terrain was the cage. The roadblock was the trigger. The avalanche was the shock, and the halberd was the finishing nail. All the Swiss had to do now was wait. The morning of November 15th, 1315, was cold and bleak. Under a pale winter sky, Duke Leopold's army began its fateful march. The column of steel and silk stretched for over a mile, a river of men flowing toward Schwedz. They were confident, maybe even bored. They were marching into a tomb and mistook it for a parade ground. As the head of the column pushed deeper into the pass, they rounded a bend and came to an abrupt halt. The way was blocked. Confusion rippled through the vanguard. An annoyance. The knights at the front shouted orders, trying to clear the path. But behind them, the main body of the army kept moving forward, blind to the problem. The long line began to compress, squeezing itself into the narrowest part of the pass. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, a dense mass of men and horses, trapped between the icy lake and the steep cliff. This was the moment. High on the slope, a signal was given. What happened next was the stuff of nightmares. With a deafening roar, the mountainside itself came alive. The Swiss unleashed their avalanche. A torrent of massive boulders and logs crashed down the steep slope. The effect was catastrophic. The thunderous crash slammed into the packed column. Men were crushed flat. Horses were maimed, their terrified screams mixing with the shouts of their riders. The orderly procession vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a maelstrom of chaos and death. The rocks and logs didn't just kill, they choked the path, turning the kill box into a meat grinder. The psychological shock was devastating. These soldiers were trained to fight men, not the landscape itself. The panic was absolute. The war horses became instruments of destruction, bucking and trampling anyone in their path. The tight formation was now a death sentence. There was no room to maneuver, no way to form a line, no path to escape. The glittering army had dissolved into a screaming mob. And then, as if from the earth itself, the Swiss descended. They came in waves, flowing down the mountainside like a lethal tide. They were a terrifying sight. Fierce men of the mountains, wielding their fearsome halberds with grim determination. This is where the halberd proved its horrific worth. The Swiss fighters systematically dismantled the Habsburg army. They didn't engage in heroic duels. They were brutally pragmatic. They targeted the horses first, using the axe blades to slash at their legs. As the nobles crashed to the ground, weighed down by armor, the Swiss swarmed them. The hooks of the halberds pulled them down, flipping them onto their backs like turtles. Helpless, the knights could only watch as the Swiss used the spear points to find the gaps in their defenses. A thrust through the visor, a jab under the arm, a brutal strike to the groin. It was savage, intimate, and ruthlessly efficient. The battle had become a slaughter. There was no quarter given. For the Swiss, this was a struggle for extermination. The chivalric rules of war, where a captured nobleman could be ransomed, meant nothing here. A dead knight couldn't return to threaten their families. Chronicles state that the Swiss, unfamiliar with such customs, brutally butchered everyone they could reach. The terrain itself continued its deadly work. Knights who tried to escape were pushed toward the lake. The icy November water, combined with the weight of their armor, was a death sentence. They sank like stones. Local legend says the lake turns blood red at midnight on the anniversary of the battle. Others were driven into the treacherous marshland, where their heavy horses bogged down, making them easy prey for the swift-moving Swiss. The very ground they had marched over had become their grave. The chaos was total. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. The rear of the Habsburg column, finally realizing the disaster, broke and fled, hounded by Swiss who had been stationed to cut off their retreat. The proudest army in Europe was now a scattered, terrified rabble. When the bloody work was done, the narrow pass was a charnel house. The butcher's bill was staggering. While Swiss casualties were minimal, the Habsburgs suffered a catastrophic defeat. Estimates claim between 1,500 and 2,000 of Leopold's men were killed. This included a huge portion of his knightly corps. Hundreds of nobles from powerful families lay dead in the mud and water. And what of Duke Leopold I? He was with the rear of the column and managed to escape. He survived, but his army, his pride, and his reputation were destroyed. The chronicler John of Winterthur described him riding away, half dead from extreme sorrow. The arrogant duke who came with ropes to hang rebels had been utterly humiliated, witnessing the annihilation of his elite force by the very peasants he had so fatally underestimated. News of what happened at Morgarten spread like wildfire. It was shocking. An army of commoners had not just defeated, but massacred one of the most prestigious feudal armies of the time. The established order was shaken. The battle sent a clear message. The age of the knights' unquestioned dominance was coming to a bloody end. The most immediate consequence was political. Just weeks later, in December 1315, the cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden met and signed the Pact of Brunnen. This was a pivotal moment. The pact went further than their original defensive agreement, formalizing a political confederation. It stipulated that none of them would recognize an outside lord without the consent of the others. Morgarten had given them the confidence to take this crucial step. For the first time, the document used the term Eidgenossen, Oath Brothers, a name that would become synonymous with the Swiss people. This pact is considered by many to be the true foundation of the old Swiss Confederacy. The military legacy was equally transformative. Morgarten demonstrated that well-led infantry with the right tactics and weapons could destroy an army of elite cavalry, especially in favorable terrain. The Swiss had learned a vital lesson. An unarmored man with a 7-foot halberd could kill a fully armored knight. They didn't rest on their laurels. They began to refine their tactics, adopting even longer weapons, like the 18-foot pike, and developing the terrifying pike square formation. The Oath Brothers, who ambushed Leopold's army, would evolve into the most feared shock infantry in all of Europe. For the next 200 years, Swiss mercenaries would be the gold standard for foot soldiers, their reputation born in the bloody pass at Morgarten. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was the forging of an identity. Morgarten was the first great military triumph of the fledgling Confederacy. It was a shared story of David versus Goliath, of simple mountain folk triumphing over an arrogant foreign invader. It became a cornerstone of Swiss patriotism, a symbol of their fierce independence. It was the moment they stopped being just a collection of mountain valleys and started becoming a nation, defined not by a common language, but by a common purpose and a shared memory of a cold November morning when they refused to be broken. The Battle of Morgarten was far more than a successful ambush. It was a turning point written in a mountain pass for all of Europe to read. A lesson about the fatal cost of arrogance, the supreme importance of terrain, and the unstoppable power of a people united in defense of their freedom. On that day, the combination of a brilliantly engineered killbox, the fury of the attackers, and the revolutionary halberd allowed a small militia to achieve the impossible. They didn't just defeat an army, they annihilated it. The flower of Habsburg chivalry wilted on the shores of Lake Erie, crushed by the very peasants they had come to enslave. Duke Leopold came seeking to reimpose an old order. Instead, he fled from the bloody birth of something new, a confederation of oath brothers, a nation forged in the crucible of the perfect ambush. What do you think was the most critical factor in the Swiss victory? The terrain, the halberd, or Habsburg arrogance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for joining us on the battlefield of history. We'll see you in the next one.